Emma Collins and Daniel Collins arrived in Ontario as newlyweds chasing a dream. But within days, Emma's body was pulled from beneath the ice. Margaret Hill watched their uneasy smiles at the lodge. Claire Donovan revealed the fears Emma had confessed before the wedding. And Victor Hayes emerged as the shadowy figure whose secrets tied everything together. What began as a honeymoon quickly spiraled into one of the most chilling true crime stories Ontario had ever seen. Emma Collins had always imagined her honeymoon as the happiest chapter of her life. At 27, she was radiant with joy, glowing with the excitement of being newly married. Friends described her as warm and trusting, the kind of woman who smiled at strangers and believed in second chances. Her husband, Daniel Collins, seemed to be her perfect match on the surface, tall, charming, and confident. Together they planned a trip that felt like a dream, a quiet escape to the snowy landscapes of Ontario, far from the noise of their busy city lives. The destination was a secluded lodge by Lake Muskoka, where the world outside seemed frozen in time. For Emma, the trip promised intimacy, peace, and the beginning of a new life. The couple arrived at the lodge during a week when the area was hushed by heavy snow. The lake shimmered beneath a thick sheet of ice, reflecting the pale winter sun. Photographs Emma posted online captured her happiness, wrapped in a wool scarf, cheeks pink from the cold. The comments flooded in with admiration and congratulations. To anyone watching from afar, the newlyweds appeared picture-perfect, living out a romantic fairy tale. But beneath the surface, faint cracks were already forming. Daniel, though attentive in public, seemed distant in private moments. He avoided long conversations, often retreating into silence when Emma tried to talk about their future. The lodge owner, Margaret Hill, noticed their subtle tension during check-in. She saw the way Emma's eyes lingered on Daniel, searching for warmth, and how his gaze seemed elsewhere. Still, Emma brushed aside the unease. She convinced herself it was only exhaustion from the wedding chaos, a natural lull after weeks of stress. She chose to focus on the snow-covered beauty around her, never imagining the darkness that awaited beneath the ice. The lodge sat on the edge of Lake Muskoka, a stretch of frozen water that seemed endless under the pale winter sky. Snow covered the cabins like a heavy blanket, muting every sound except the crunch of boots on ice. The place was meant for couples seeking seclusion, with fireplaces glowing in each room and windows that framed the stillness of the lake. For Emma, it felt magical at first, as though she had stepped into a postcard. She walked along the wooden pathways, taking in the frosted trees and the quiet air that carried only the distant call of a bird. Yet the deeper she breathed in the silence, the more the atmosphere began to feel unsettling, as if the beauty hid something cold and watchful. Inside the lodge, Emma and Daniel settled into their room. Daniel immediately busied himself with his phone, ignoring the view Emma admired from the frosted glass window. She imagined the honeymoon would bring them closer, but instead, she sensed a wall growing taller between them. Emma pushed the worry aside, telling herself that love needed patience. At dinner, they met Margaret Hill, the owner, who greeted them warmly. Margaret, with years of observing guests, quickly noticed the imbalance between Emma's eager energy and Daniel's restrained demeanor. She wondered quietly if the couple's smiles were more for show than for each other. As the nights fell, the setting turned darker. The frozen lake creaked under the pressure of ice, sending eerie echoes across the empty shore. The cabins seemed swallowed by shadows, each gust of wind rattling the wooden frames. While Emma wrapped herself in a blanket and dreamed of a future filled with warmth, the quiet landscape carried a different promise. It was not of romance, but of secrets waiting to break through the ice. On the fourth morning of their stay, Daniel walked into the lodge with a frantic expression and announced that Emma was missing. He claimed she had gone for a walk along the frozen lake at sunrise, something she had mentioned wanting to do, and never returned. His voice carried urgency, but his tone lacked the raw panic expected from a man whose wife had vanished. Margaret Hill immediately called local authorities, and soon search teams gathered around the icy expanse. They combed the shoreline, leaving deep footprints in the snow, their voices echoing Emma's name into the frozen air. At first, the assumption was simple. Emma must have wandered onto thin ice, unaware of the danger, and fallen through. The lake was deceptive that time of year, with some areas sturdy and others fragile. Rescue divers were dispatched, cutting into the ice to search the freezing waters below. The operation was grueling, and each passing hour lowered the chance of survival. Neighbors and staff gathered quietly at the lodge, watching the scene with heavy hearts. As daylight faded and no trace of Emma was found, whispers began to circulate. A young newlywed disappearing without a sound felt too strange, too abrupt. Margaret remembered hearing muffled arguments late at night from their cabin, moments that contradicted the cheerful smiles Emma had shown earlier. Searchers noted that Daniel seemed oddly composed, giving only short answers when questioned. His story never changed, but it also lacked depth, as if rehearsed. What began as a rescue mission slowly shifted into something darker. Investigators started to wonder if Emma's disappearance was more than a tragic accident. Beneath the calm surface of Lake Muskoka, they suspected, lay the hidden truth of what had really happened to the bride who came seeking love. 2 days after Emma vanished, divers cut through the thick sheet of ice covering Lake Muskoka. The search had been exhausting, with teams braving freezing temperatures and dangerous conditions, but persistence finally brought a grim discovery. Beneath the glassy surface, Emma's body was found, suspended in the icy water as though trapped in time. Her wedding ring still clung to her finger, a chilling reminder that this was supposed to be the happiest trip of her life. The sight shook the entire search team, and the community that had held on to hope realized the story was no longer about rescue but about answers. The initial assumption of a tragic accident quickly began to crumble. The divers reported marks on her wrists, dark bruises that could not be explained by the fall alone. These signs hinted at restraint, as though she had been overpowered before the water claimed her. Investigators examined her body carefully, noting inconsistencies that contradicted Daniel's story of her simply wandering off onto the ice. Emma had not stumbled into danger. She had been placed there. News of the discovery spread quickly, and whispers grew louder. Locals gathered outside the lodge, their faces pale, exchanging uneasy glances as rumors swirled. How could a joyful bride, barely days into her marriage, meet such a cruel fate? Suspicion now focused squarely on Daniel, whose demeanor seemed unnervingly calm despite the tragedy. Some noticed his lack of visible grief, while others pointed to his vague explanations and short temper when questioned. Emma's recovery marked a turning point. What had begun as a heartbreaking disappearance transformed into a full-fledged homicide investigation. The frozen lake no longer looked like a symbol of beauty and peace. It had become the silent witness to a crime buried beneath the ice. Daniel quickly became the center of suspicion once Emma's body was recovered from beneath the ice. Investigators turned their attention to him, dissecting every detail of his life and marriage. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture. Just weeks before their wedding, Daniel had taken out a sizable life insurance policy on Emma, naming himself as the sole beneficiary. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a practical step, but to detectives, it suggested planning and intent. The timing was too deliberate, too calculated, to ignore. His alibi also began to crumble under closer scrutiny. Daniel claimed he had been in the lodge room the entire morning Emma disappeared, but staff members remembered otherwise. Margaret Hill recalled seeing him pacing outside near the cabins, his face pale, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. When questioned, his explanations seemed vague, his words carefully chosen. Detectives noticed how his grief appeared forced, his tears too easily summoned for the cameras. Financial records revealed another layer of motive. Daniel was drowning in debt, the kind that no ordinary job could fix. He owed money to creditors and had recently lost a risky investment. Emma, on the other hand, came from a modest but stable background, with savings she had planned to use for their future home. The life insurance payout would have solved every problem Daniel faced. Despite these discoveries, the case was far from simple. There was no direct evidence tying him to Emma's death beneath the ice. The bruises suggested restraint, but the scene itself offered no fingerprints or witnesses. The police knew he was hiding something, yet suspicion alone could not secure a conviction. The investigation hung in uncertainty, leaving Emma's death shrouded in questions that demanded answers. The investigation took a turn when Emma's best friend, Claire Donovan, reached out to the authorities. Claire had been close to Emma for nearly a decade. and she carried memories of late-night conversations, whispered secrets, and shared dreams. When she heard about Emma's death, she felt a deep ache but also a sense of responsibility to speak up. She recalled how, just weeks before the wedding, Emma had confessed her doubts. Emma had told her that Daniel could be controlling at times, dismissing her opinions and keeping secrets about his finances. Claire had advised caution, but Emma, filled with hope and love, chose to believe marriage would soften Daniel's edges. Claire's testimony provided investigators with context that Daniel's behavior alone could not explain. It revealed that Emma had entered the marriage with a shadow of fear, though she tried to mask it with optimism. Claire also shared that Emma had once hinted at overhearing suspicious phone calls Daniel made late at night, conversations he quickly ended whenever she walked into the room. At the time, Emma brushed it off, thinking she might be overreacting. Hearing Claire's account, detectives began piecing together a clearer picture of Daniel's motives. Emma's doubts, the insurance policy, and his mounting debts all formed a chain that pointed toward foul play. What had once been interpreted as a tragic accident was now leaning strongly toward a calculated act. Claire's words gave Emma a voice beyond the grave, adding depth to the portrait of a young woman who wanted to believe in love but may have sensed danger all along. For investigators, this new layer of evidence reignited momentum. It was no longer just about suspicion. Now, it was about uncovering the hidden connections that could finally expose the truth behind Emma's death. As detectives pressed deeper into Daniel's past, a new figure emerged from the shadows. Victor Hayes, a former co-worker who had once been close to him. Victor came forward reluctantly, drawn in after hearing about Emma's death on the news. He revealed that Daniel owed him a significant sum of money, debts that stretched back to a failed business venture the two had attempted years earlier. What began as an ambitious plan to start a small logistics company ended in collapse, leaving Victor bitter and Daniel desperate. Victor claimed that Daniel had borrowed even more afterward, promising repayment once he married Emma. Investigators were struck by the timing of these revelations. If Daniel had seen Emma not as a partner, but as a financial solution, Victor's testimony suddenly connected the missing pieces. But Victor's role was not entirely innocent. He admitted to threatening Daniel in the past, warning him that if he did not pay back the money, there would be consequences. His calm description of Daniel's behavior painted a chilling picture of a man cornered by pressure. The possibility of Victor's influence shifted the investigation from a simple domestic crime to something entangled in outside forces. Detectives began questioning whether Daniel had acted purely on greed or whether Victor had played a more active role. Phone records hinted at late-night conversations between the two men shortly before the honeymoon. The content of those calls was unknown, but their frequency suggested planning. Victor's presence complicated everything. Was he merely a creditor desperate for repayment, or had he pushed Daniel toward violence? Some investigators began to suspect that Emma's death was not solely the result of her husband's greed, but a crime woven from desperation, debt, and manipulation by a man lurking in the background. The discovery of phone records between Daniel and Victor gave the investigation a startling new depth. In the days leading up to the honeymoon, Daniel had called Victor multiple times, sometimes late at night and sometimes during work hours. The timing alone raised suspicion, but it was the tone of the messages investigators recovered that truly shifted the case. Though cryptic, the texts hinted at a plan that would fix everything and references to her in ways that could only mean Emma. Detectives could not yet prove the details, but the implication was undeniable. Victor was more than a bystander waiting for money. He was a piece of the machinery that led to Emma's death. Digging further, police discovered that Victor had a long history of financial troubles himself, including gambling debts and brushes with criminal activity. His reputation for intimidation was well known among former colleagues, who described him as charming on the surface but ruthless when crossed. If Daniel had felt trapped by debt, Victor may have been the one tightening the noose. Investigators began to suspect that the life insurance policy, once seen as Daniel's sole idea, might have been encouraged or even demanded by Victor as a way to secure repayment. The theory of conspiracy gained traction. Detectives considered the possibility that Victor may have traveled near the lodge, though no direct evidence placed him at Lake Muskoka. Still, the idea that Emma's death was not just the result of a husband's greed, but part of a larger scheme unsettled everyone working the case. The chilling realization emerged that Emma may have been doomed before she ever stepped onto the frozen shore. What appeared to be a private marital tragedy now looked like a calculated crime orchestrated by more than one hand. The pressure on Daniel finally reached its breaking point when investigators confronted him with the evidence. The phone records, the insurance documents, and Claire's testimony formed a web too tight to escape. In the interrogation room, his carefully constructed calm began to fracture. His voice trembled as he admitted that he and Emma had argued on the morning of her disappearance. He described leading her onto the ice under the guise of wanting to take a walk together. When the argument escalated, he shoved her down, pinned her wrists, and left her helpless against the frozen surface. His words painted a picture as cold as the lake itself, a betrayal of trust carried out in silence. But Daniel did not stop there. In an effort to save himself, he shifted the focus toward Victor. He claimed Victor had pushed him into the act, threatening to expose his debts and ruin his life unless he found a way to repay. According to Daniel, Victor had suggested that Emma's death would solve everything: the debt, the pressure, and his financial ruin. Daniel portrayed himself as a man cornered, manipulated into carrying out a crime he might never have considered alone. Investigators weighed his confession carefully. On one hand, it was an admission of guilt, a direct acknowledgement that he had caused Emma's death. On the other, it introduced the possibility that Victor had orchestrated the circumstances from a distance, pulling strings that Daniel was too weak to cut. The complexity of the case deepened, and the line between victimizer and accomplice blurred. For the detectives, the confession was both a breakthrough and a burden. It confirmed Emma's death was no accident, yet it also opened a darker question. Was Daniel the true architect of the crime, or merely a pawn in Victor's game? The trial that followed was one of the most chilling Ontario had seen in years. The courtroom filled with reporters, neighbors, and strangers drawn by the haunting story of a young bride found beneath the ice. Daniel sat at the defense table, his once confident demeanor replaced with a hollow stare. Across from him, prosecutors laid out the evidence with precision: the life insurance policy, the financial records, the bruises on Emma's body, and his own damning confession. The jury listened in silence, their eyes fixed on the man who had turned a honeymoon into a crime scene. Victor Hayes was also brought to trial, charged with conspiracy and coercion. Though he never touched Emma, the digital trail between him and Daniel painted a picture of manipulation and pressure. The late-night phone calls, the cryptic text messages, and his history of intimidation created a shadow that hung over every detail of the case. Prosecutors argued that without Victor's influence, Emma might still be alive. Victor, however, maintained his innocence, insisting he was merely a creditor demanding repayment. Witnesses gave the story its human weight. Margaret Hill testified about the couple's strained behavior at the lodge, her observations adding credibility to the prosecution's claims. Claire Donovan's words echoed through the courtroom as she described Emma's fears and doubts before the wedding, giving the victim a voice that could not be silenced. In the end, both men were convicted, Daniel for murder, Victor for conspiracy. The verdict brought a sense of closure, but not comfort. Emma's life was cut short in a place meant for love and memory. The frozen lake that had once reflected beauty was now forever marked by tragedy, a reminder of how trust can be betrayed and how darkness can hide beneath the brightest smiles.